get this last session underway then, if people are back. I am going to turn it over to the inimitable Tom D'Amico to introduce Alison for our last session, Teachers as Change Agent. Take it away, Tom.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Richard Francham, a colleague of mine when we worked together 30 years ago. Richard was pushing the envelope with new ways of learning with interdisciplinary work at that time. And I was offering Ontario's first ever multimedia course in 1990, which was based on project-based learning without a curriculum guide. And somehow I wish we could return to 1990. The dialogue yesterday and today has been excellent. Grace mentioned that it's great when an educator closes the door and then does what's right. While that's encouraging, and we do see these pockets of excellence in most schools and across the public education systems, we really do need to have all educators keep their doors open, and not just their doors, but we need them to open their classrooms to offer the world as their canvas for learning. And then they collectively will do what's right. As with any conference where critical thinking is welcomed, I'd like to challenge several notions that I've heard over the 2 days, since it really is not a zero-sum game. It's not an all or nothing contract. So I don't personally support the notion that public education does not create well-rounded individuals, since there's many examples of wonderful success stories in public education. By not recognizing the many successes, we do a disservice to those that have succeeded and are now changing the world. There's examples of creative thinkers and problem solvers and youth that are making a difference right now in our publicly funded schools, and they're not waiting until they get out of the school system. I'm a pragmatist, so to think that we can blow up the currently publicly funded school system, where we have powerful provincial unions and politically elected officials as the architects and funders, is too utopian for me personally. So I choose to look at what I can do within the limitations I have to work within. The wisdom is in recognizing what we can control and what we can't, and knowing that the individual experiences are all valid, as we've heard over the last 2 days, but they may not represent another user's experience. I'd also challenge the myth I heard about teachers leaving the public school system, at least in Ontario, as we've had almost no loss of teachers once they enter the profession. However, the reason I have an interest in this conference and I advocate for school reform is if we go back to the start of the conference and we heard words from June Girvan. When we add an equity lens to the discussion, we find that our school public system is not meeting the needs of all students, whether they're marginalized due to poverty, or they're racialized youth, or they have different learning styles, or they're students that have been oppressed in the current system. There really is a need for change. So I believe personally in the philosophy of Sir Ken, and when he advocated that every student can succeed and every student has a gift inside them waiting to be unleashed, because I share that belief, I do think our public education system needs to reform, find ways to be more flexible, have more options, and have new ways of assessing within every school and every board. In our school system, we have personalized learning program that supports students in one class or two classes without bells and flexible curriculum. They focus the afternoon on life, not curriculum. We have a program for pregnant teens. We have a program for homeless youth. We have a program for students that have dropped out, and while they were close to graduating, they didn't attain that goal. And we have a program for youth that are involved in the criminal youth justice system. So these are important programs because each student deserves an education, and they need these programs to meet with success. But what's always puzzled me in my 30 years in public education is that students that were not successful in our traditional classes meet with success in these programs, and they thrive when they learn in these safe spaces, not based on traditional courses, not organized by birth dates and confined by bells. In terms of homeschooling, we're not seeing thousands of students leaving public education, even during COVID. In a board of 45,000 students, we had 271 move to homeschooling. So 99.4% of all of our students are remaining in our traditional school system. But I envision a system that supports those students that are choosing homeschooling, one that supports the students who want to learn at school, and a new system where students learn in hybrid and flexible models, both in person, at home, and online. My goal would be to look at how we can support all the diverse needs of students through more options, more flexibility, and looking how reform of the current system would benefit everyone, including involving our communities to be more part of each neighborhood school. That system would involve learning outdoors, learning from others, teaching others, and using technology in ways that allow students to connect and learn, but not ways that they did without technology. So not taking a worksheet and creating an electronic worksheet is a quick example. My personal interest is how to reform public education to scale, not to focus solely on unschooling with charter-like schools or private schools that may end up unintentionally increasing the equity gap for those that don't have the family resources to unlearn on their own and need to send their children to their locally public funded school. So now you know my bias and my lens that I'm bringing to this introduction, and that may have shaped some of Alison as a member of the school board that we work together in. To do this in Ottawa Catholic, our attempt at reform, we're using Dr. Michael Fullan's deep learning framework. It connects us to 1,500 schools across 10 countries, and that's what our next speaker will focus on. This framework looks at global competencies as a key outcome, not a side benefit of education. And it looks at student passion and allowing time for this passion, not solely surface learning. It's learning that sticks, not learning that is memorized for a mark and then forgotten. And it's learning that makes a difference to change the world, whether that's locally or globally, based on students' interest now in each grade. Last week, I had the privilege of presenting to the International Development Bank at their Latin American and Caribbean Education Summit. It was disheartening to hear that 20 of the 26 countries have not had students return to school since COVID last March. They now have millions of students not attending school in person or being educated at home. These will become dropouts at a time when the economy has also crashed. The encouraging part of the 3 days of dialogue with the ministers of education from these countries was that they all share an appetite for reform. They want to return to school in ways they didn't have before COVID, a new vision for education, and that's encouraging. The focus is on social and emotional learning and addressing the inequities that came up in all of the discussions about education, and we share that here in Ottawa. So your next speaker is Alison Kinahan. She's the coordinator of leading and learning in the Ottawa Catholic School Board. She's one of the co-leads for deep learning, also a strong advocate and a leader for equity. Most recently, she's moved her focus for professional learning to look at anti-Black racism and unconscious bias. Alison sits in a unique position in our board because she works with the Faculty of Education, preparing new teachers, and then she works with the new teachers when they start in our board through NTIP, New Teacher Induction Program. She works with Leading and Learning to run equity, leadership, and coaching programs. And through these programs, I believe we're reforming public education. So thanks, Alison, for your experiences and sharing your expertise with those that were able to join today and to critically listen to our perspectives.
So yes, this is, I was able to tune in yesterday for the introduction, and it was great to see this conference come to light. I know that June brought her desire for a child-friendly Ottawa to our Catholic board, just like she has done with, Dean Richard Barwell and other organizations across the city. And so I want to thank, starting by thanking Richard, June, and many other individuals who worked to host this important conference. Also, I'd like to thank Tom for supporting this work and his encouragement of my involvement today. And to thank all the other facilitators of the learning. The ideas that you're bringing, the ideologies, and your love for children and youth, not only of this generation, previous generations, and the next generations, is extremely appreciated. And I very much appreciate the learning partnerships that have been built in this conference. I see many familiar names on everybody's little square across the screen. And, it really does speak to a lot of what I'm going to speak to today in terms of the learning partnerships. So I'm going to focus today on shifting education. And we're looking at education reform. And so what does that mean when we think about practice as educators? And what does that mean for structures in terms of the system, the schools, the classrooms, and those types of designs? But I wanted to start a little bit with giving you a bit of my background, because it really has shaped how I work with the educators that I do work with. And so I just wanted to start by saying that I was born on Treaty 6 land in Saskatchewan. And I mention this because it is important to how I was raised and how I learned about the world around me. And I just want to recognize that Treaty 6, the traditional land keepers there were Cree, Nakota, and the Saulteaux. And Saskatoon now is and a lot of Western Canada, Manitoba and Saskatchewan is seen as the homeland of the Métis. And, it's part of my education to impart and my learning to impart with my daughter, but also those that I work with in terms of Canada's role in creating the systems and structures that have marginalized so many. So I just wanted to start with that, and just knowing that I grew up in Saskatchewan in a very small town, very homogeneous, and that really causes me to reflect on where I've come from and how I enter the classroom and how I enter the profession. And so much of what we do in our workshops and our professional learning at the board level is really starting to think about our positions as educators. And I'm going to go into that a little bit. So what is my why? And we always ask our teachers to think about, what is your why? And some people have, mentioned that in the previous sessions, that, we have a love of students, we have a love of children, we really want to, encourage and them to be their full self in life. And when I was in high school myself, I was involved in student government, and it was really then that I started to notice the interactions between school administration, teachers, and students, and who had power, who didn't have power, and what structures and rigidity was placed in the school system. And I have to say, and I told this story to Richard as well, at one point I thought, I'm going to become the Minister of Education in Saskatchewan because I can change things so that student voice and student experiences are, at the forefront of our education experiences as students. As you can tell, that didn't happen. But, what I have done and what has, how that has shaped me become an educator is important. And we encourage educators to go through those questions that you see there. What is my identity? How have I been socialized to see the world? And what do I believe? And what have I learned, and what will be my learning? So part of my learning comes from being in a 4-year BEd program. And I do work with the Faculty of Education on their Teacher Education Advisory Committee here at the University of Ottawa. And, I often think about the different structures that we have in terms of teacher education, and understanding how teachers are educated in those programs, how it is that they are led to believe certain things, how they graduate with certain ideas, and then they enter the school system. And so, I've had the benefit of teaching after I left and got my 4-year degree in a variety of different roles. And I really think it's important as an educator in shifting my practice of experiencing different roles in the school. So I've been a student success teacher, a classroom teacher in schools, a resource teacher. And then I moved on to the board level. And I think it's those experiences that have really you know, particularly being a student success teacher, being a resource teacher, being that literacy learning partner embedded in a school, you really get to know the students. And for me, that's when I really started to think about the students and understanding the structures that are in place that I thought about, you know, loftily when I was in grade 12 in high school, about the things that could be changed and shifted. So I bring to us a question today. How can we shift practice and structures to ensure equitable and inclusive education in decolonized schools and systems? I don't know if we'll arrive anywhere at the end of this today, but I think I can provide some examples of how we're starting to move in that direction for sure. And I'm leaving you with some things that I'm thinking about in ways that I would like to move forward as a school. So yes, I just wanted to ask everybody if you could, I'm just gonna put this slide up here. So thinking about deep learning, as Tom mentioned, it is part of something that Michael Fullan worked on, new pedagogies for deep learning. And it's been driven by his work in education. And it's the idea to foster deep learning so that all learners contribute to the common good, address global challenges, and flourish in a complex world. We build knowledge and practices that foster deep learning and whole system change. And as Tom mentioned, it's a global partnership with many countries across the globe. And as you can see on the screen here, the inner circle is the student, and I've kind of blown up the outer pieces. My critical consciousness, I always have to question what I see. So to me, the student really should be the biggest part of the central image, but it's not. So I've pulled out the global competencies because that's what the student is working toward. And so it's important that our students are working towards these in ways and the learning partnerships, the pedagogical practices, the leveraging digital and the learning environments is how it is that we as the educator can support those students in developing those competencies. And, you know, I said to Richard, it would be interesting if we move towards competency-based education instead of curriculum-based education in different subject areas, and that we utilize different subjects in order to achieve the competency. And so hopefully at some point we'll get to a place that you know, we have that as a major feature of public education, and that, you know, students move forward through the system when they are ready and when they've gained those. I mean, these are my ideas. Again, this is sort of some of the stuff that I think about and that I talk to others about and that we think about moving forward with. And so the framework of the global structure allows us to really think about the ways that we can shift teacher practice, the ways that we can shift structures, and you know, how is it that students are attaining the global competencies and moving forward with their learning. So we've been involved as a school board now for 7 years, and the deep learning is happening in all of our schools. And I've been very fortunate to be a part of some of those different ways that we've done that. And so I just wanted to throw this out there because I'm going to talk a little bit about two major components, obviously, the student, the child first, and the educator. And so I'm just wondering if you guys could use the chat. And there I said, I'm going to correct myself because of my bias. The individuals that are on the call and on the Zoom, if you could please put your thoughts. What is it that you think the child's role in education is? And what is it that you think the educator's role in So if you could just maybe put child and then what you feel their role is, and then educator and what you feel their role is. So Nicole has said that the child leads learning. Ian is suggesting that the child is open, flourishing, teacher is listening. Richard has commented that the teacher follows the child or follows the child's lead. Facilitators, educators, facilitator, create an environment for collective flourishing. Wow, we could write a book with all of these different ideas that are coming across here. Yes, Ted brings up a good point about, the ideas around this. And I often think about the countries that are involved in the deep learning framework. And, most of them come from colonized countries. And so then that makes me think about, what is this structure that we are using? Is it inclusive of all types of different education and different ways of knowing, learning, and being? So again, I think we still need to question and have that critical consciousness of what we are using and how we're moving forward with student learning and child learning. And so I thank you all for contributing for that, the comments. I'm hoping there's some way we can, save that chat pod, because there's so many wonderful ways to understand. And so part of this is looking at the student-driven learning. And this is a learning model that comes from Fullan, Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn in their book, Coherence. And it really talks about that student learner model, and it's the student at the forefront of this. And we think about the role for students goes beyond the notion of student voice and student agency, and combining that internal development and external connections to the world. And so for me, one of the biggest components of the deep learning framework has really, I've really thought a lot about the learning partnership. And when I moved to the board level, I worked with teachers in grades 7 to 12 primarily when I first started there. And I thought a lot about the students at grade 7, 8 and the structures that they were being, kind of forced to conform to, the number of educators they saw during a day, the length of the periods, etc. These are things that we still really need to shift. And we talked a lot about that, transform. And so we had a couple of schools, we only have one now, that has just grade 7, 8 students. So it's not confined by other schedules, other student populations. I suggested at one point to the grade 7, 8 curriculum teachers that I was working with, I said, you're in a standalone school. You don't have the constraints of all these other things that the 7 to 12 schools do. Wouldn't it be awesome if you just suspended the timetable for a month? Just try it, for a month, and think about, having one teacher who is able to be sort of a facilitator of learning for, 10, 15, 20 students. And what would that look like at the end? And how empowered would the students be in terms of moving towards that? Now, this is, 6, 7 years ago now. And just thinking about, we still haven't arrived at that place where we are suspending the timetable and suspending, all of those types of things. We still need to have structures, and we do have the unions, and we do have the minutes that are required by the ministry for particular, subjects and things of that nature. But, these are things that I would, think about for my own daughter when she was doing the remote learning at home in the spring in grade 5. And, she worked a lot with a fellow student of hers, and, she and her friend would collaborate through the learning all the time. And I just think about the structures that she has now in school, and that's not happening anymore. But she was really thriving during that time in the school. And so just thinking about the teacher and student as those key learning partnerships, and teacher, parents, and caregivers, family, and community. And, you know, when I was in the classroom as a teacher and thinking about that partnership with parents, and, you know, I think, I don't know any statistics on this, but I could generally say that I really feel that in some cases, the relationship that we could be having with the family, with the community, is very overlooked. And, you know, I've done a lot of reading around culturally responsive teaching, or it's sometimes called culturally relevant responsive pedagogy. It's really talking about, you know, the collectivist ways of knowing, being, and learning. And that the family, the partnerships, and the community are central to so many different groups around the world. And living in North America and having that individualistic point of view is really something that we need to shift. And, you know, I think about something that my dad told me when I was just graduated from teacher's education back in the 90s. And he said, you know, you're an English teacher. Now you just need to develop your lessons once and you're good to go. And, you know, that's what my dad knew education to be. Everybody got the same thing year after year, and that was it. And I really think about that goes back to my why. Who is the learning about? It's about the students. And not just the students as a collective, but each individual student and how they arrive into our space. And like somebody said earlier in the chat, how we hold space for them and think about that. So I'm going to look at a couple of examples here of how I've worked with my colleagues in order to bring those learning partnerships to a really important pivotal piece of classroom practice. And so something that we worked on in you know, grade 9 is they're now looking at de-streaming. We know that the education system has created severe inequities for students, and there are you know, a disproportionate number of students who are in locally developed applied courses who are racialized or in Black, Indigenous, and how it is that these structures have put in place certain expectations or outcomes for students. And so this was in 2014 or 15, that we looked at, you know, grade 9 English inquiry. I was working in the language as a language consultant, and just thinking about using the design thinking process, and, you know, who is the learner and what is our role as the educator. And so thinking about the structures like root cause for why we think that students are, you know, maybe underperforming, or we think of achievement gaps, which are really opportunity gaps, and different things of that nature, and really thinking about working with educators to dispel some of the ideas that we hold about particular courses, that we hold about particular students, and really shifting our educator mindset and accessing and using a voice from the students in front of us, the youth, and really how do we get to the student thinking. And so this was a little network that we had, and it really brought forward the idea and some of the things that the students said. You know, they had advice for the teachers. They said, be a bit harder on the students. Don't treat us any different from academic students. Do more hands-on work. It's better for us to learn when doing hands-on work. They had some beliefs about applied English courses. Sorry, this is all from students who were in applied course. For people who aren't in a high grade level of intelligence. Another student said, I expect to learn almost as much as academic, but learn it differently. And so if we really are in a full learning partnership with our students, we really need to have the proper mindset when we walk in, that all students have the potential to work through a rigorous course, and that we have high expectations for all students. And that comes from, culturally responsive pedagogy or teaching. And just going through my notes here, I'm really excited to see what de-streaming is going to look like in grade 9 moving forward. Again, it's certainly going to take a lot of work and change, and we'll figure it out as we go. Another example that I looked and worked with was a grade 7-8 learning network, and we worked with students. And we had a focus on, we knew that in our board data that we had students who had identified learning disabilities, but were not achieving as they should be. And we had to work with our educators to, again, dispel a lot of ideas about the profile of a student who had a learning disability in whatever area it was, if maybe executive functioning, different things of that type. And also, I've put here students learning English rather than an English language learner. And I think we need to start looking at our students who are learning English as multilingual learners. So I think there's a certain idea that we have when students, we identify them as an English language learner, automatically in our head, for those of us who are of the dominant narrative, have certain thoughts about those students and what they're able to accomplish. But if you are a student who is learning English, you are probably more likely to have multiple languages. And the idea that, we need to shift our understanding and how we box kids into particular ways. And so we looked at how it is that we could shift educator practice and schools practice so that we could get rid of some of those opportunity gaps that weren't being provided to the students, such as using they needed to learn. And so this is one school's challenge of practice. So to continue to develop those learning goals and success criteria as part of the explicit instruction, and that the teacher's instruction needs to be responsive to student needs. So that continual cycle of feedback with the educator. And this was, very much a part of, in this network, looking at leveraging digital and that learning partnership. Again, the teacher really getting to know the student. So I'm going to move forward and thinking about the role of the educator. And so it is shifting dramatically. As I mentioned earlier, we live and have grown up living in a culture of tell in our education systems. We tell the kids this, we give them the information, and it has always been sort of accepted, and that we are the experts. And we need to break these ideologies and shift it. And I've been reading this book. I'm going to hold it up and it's going to be backwards for you, Being the Change. And it's by Sarah K. Ahmed. It just came out this year. And she has a really important opening in here. And she talks about how, as educators, we need to enter into our practice. And she says, she draws from the work of Edgar Schein in his book, Humble Inquiry from 2014. And so Sarah says, to be fully open to understanding the experiences of others, we must be willing to not be experts. Instead, we should practice being learners who enter conversations with humility and ask questions when we don't understand. And to me, this means that we need to put the students first, that we clearly get to know them and understand they're going through and how they're learning. So learning partnerships is that the student becomes the main priority. We need to set our egos aside, and we need to be learners every day. And to do this, we need to be reflective practitioners. And we need to think about our teaching as a craft that we must hone every chance we get. And I think a lot of times we need to let go of, and I'm trying to disrupt those ideas of, this is my course. I can't let that happen because the integrity of the course will be shifted, or, this is my subject. I am the expert. I know these things. And I even think about how it is that we place ourselves in relation to the students. So I'm really starting to shift the idea of saying my students, because that, brings to mind an idea of ownership and of a power change there. And so, the students in our class, like I'm trying to think of how to decolonize that and shift the thinking so that we are a part of that. Zaretta Hammond is another book that we're currently using and thinking about the idea that, as the educator, and there's many important points on here that Fullan, Quinn, and Joanne McEachran have brought forward. But it is thinking about how it is as an individual, how it is as an educator, practitioner, that I can widen my lens. And so another book I'm gonna reference here too is this one. It's Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. And in here, she talks about educators needing to widen their aperture. That is thinking about our view as something that is, we need to widen our aperture like a camera lens and let in more light. And if we're able to do that, we will see the students in front of us, and we'll think about those students and understand and be able to see that they have different ways of knowing, learning, being, and then we should be able to honor and incorporate that into the lessons. So these are things that we are working on embedding in all of our networks, professional learning for the educators, and shifting that practice. And it really all does dovetail with our deep learning framework, in that, the student is at the center of that, and that we can use the 4 elements of the deep learning in order to move forward. And so I just want to give an example of a really rich deep learning inquiry that happened in one of our schools a few years ago. This was out in Fitzroy Harbor, in our furthest part of our school board. And they created a connection with a school in Haiti. And it all came about because the teacher had presented a book to the students. And in the book, the teacher, in the book, the poet talks about that anybody can change the color of someone else's day. And so the kids had a question, and they said, like, how can we change the color of someone else's day? And so they really thought about that and talked about that. And so what they did was they dove deeply into the cultural traditions, beliefs, and values of those people living in Haiti, which is where the book was centered. And so through that, they were able to connect with the author of the book. They were able to connect with the Haitian embassy in Ottawa here, and have a connection there. The ambassador visited the school, and they were able to really understand and make a difference. And so here is an example of the day that the ambassador came to the student. And it really does speak to student voices and impact. So throughout this almost half a year or more learning, and all the curriculum was interwoven as they learned. and the students really directed the learning. And a student said, "Look, Madame," and this is kinder, these are kinder kids. "Look, Madame, my parents let me bring my camera today so I can document just like you." So just thinking about, the student understands that, you know, the learning is captured all the time, and that the assessment is ongoing and transparent continually. And so just going to go forward. What is, you know, some of the parents thought about that as well, you know, and it was infused with the Catholic Church in St. Michael, or St. Michael Church is right across the street from the school in Fitzroy Harbor, and the connection to the parish is very strong there. And they're thinking about how they could connect, and so they raised money, and they really looked at and examined the poverty in Haiti, being one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. And so they looked at how they might be able to do good and change the color of somebody's day by helping out. And so, you know, these are just some of the statements from the parents and the educators about the impact that it had on the students and the student learning. And though, you know, it was a connection between two different two different schools, as well as the partnership with Chalice in the parish, and the learning was long-lived throughout the entire school year. Here's another example of something that's wasn't specific to deep learning inquiry, but it has all the elements of the deep learning inquiry. So it's part of the teacher leadership, and I know Tom's going to put the correct title in the chat for me, but it's all about social entrepreneurship. And it's a program that we're choosing to continue in our school board, but it hasn't been funded federally. It was a federal program that went across Canada. And this teacher and his students joined in on the social entrepreneurship. And it all came about because a student asked a question. And again, it's that student driving the learning. And the student asked, can kids make a difference in the world? And so, you know, they were grade 4 students, and this was a French immersion class. And the students, you know, looked at what it is that they could do to make a difference. And so they had a dragon's den, and the students came up with ideas about different things that they could do in order to make a difference. And so they chose, you know, looking at Terry Fox Foundation, and thinking about looking at, you know, how it is that they could raise money for this as a group. And so they decided that they were going to create bracelets. You can see a little box of them there. I have a couple upstairs that they were going to sell. So they prototyped, they worked with the business owner, and they worked towards selling them and raising funds. And I got to be a part of it because they were looking for someone to be able to, you'll see the poster on the side there. They had to develop a number of advertisements for their business. And so they were looking at different designs. And so I was able to go in and give some feedback on their advertisements. And then we also, I was also able to connect them with a cancer researcher. My cousin happens to be a cancer researcher in Saskatchewan at the University of Saskatchewan Hospital. And so they did some learning around cancer treatment, etc., as part of their inquiry. And so the learning partnership, again, student driven, and how is it that it can, and it lasted the year, and all the curriculum components are woven into that. And they won a national award as a part of that. And so I'm gonna shift a little bit, because at this time in my career, I really started getting a greater awareness, and this is why I think as we need to be critical practitioners of equity, inclusive education as part of my role, but always having that, you know, in the back of my mind moving forward. So I just wanted to see if everybody in the chat could put in their definition of inclusive education. So if you don't mind taking a moment to pop that into the chat. Or equity, you could put in your idea of what you think equity is as well. Inclusive education, equitable education. So Stephen said inclusive education where no student has to leave anything at the door, no code switching, honor, respect, allow all learners to direct themselves, natural outcomes of self-directed education, Heather McTaggart has identified, education defined by, developed. All right, so we as a school board just had a professional learning day on Friday of last week and on the 13th. And all of the educational staff had a webinar to do on inclusive and equitable education and what it looks like and how it could be in the classroom. And so this is sort of where my my understanding and knowledge and experience with deep learning is merging with inclusive education, equity, anti-racism, decolonizing the school system. They're sort of all kind of coming together for me right now. I don't know where it's going to go, but there's lots of things to think about. And so a few years ago, our school board, and I know the public school board did as well, signed on to there we go, just going to flip that. This is the definition as it is by the Ministry of Education. So I'll just give you a minute to read that. It is more lengthy than that in their documentation, but that's sort of the crux of it. And many of you hit on those points in different ways in the chat. And so we were fortunate to be able to partner with the Faculty of Education. They received a provincial grant from the ministry to establish an equity knowledge mobilization network. And I was able to work with Nicholas Ingefuk there, as well as a few other professors from different faculties of education across the province. And we partnered with them in the Equity Knowledge Network to work with our new teachers. This sort of merged when I was working with new teachers as well. And so one of the things that we did was we started working with our newest teachers and really thinking about that deep learning, thinking about equity and inclusive education and anti-racism, and how it is that we can work with the teachers when they first come into our system. Not ignoring the educators who are already there, because we all have work to do. But we ran a network with professors at the university around a multitude of different interests that the educators had based on the schools that they were working in. And we really challenged the educators to think about their biases. And I saw some people putting that in there. What are their assumptions and how it is that they can counter those. And it takes a great deal of effort and understanding of ourselves and our knowledge in order to counteract that. And I think it's important, you know, the equity network that we had with them was twofold. It was to help educators build their understanding and efficacy as it relates to sustaining equity for students. And it was also, we were hoping for outcomes, you know, the students in those educators' classes, and that the students would really benefit from their educators having this shift in their mindset. And so if we think about, you know, sort of the images there, we think about the student at the center. This comes from the well-being documentation at the ministry. The NTIP image is in the middle, where we really understand student learning and student well-being. That's at the heart of the new teacher education new teacher induction program. And then thinking about that well-being strategy. And So one of the teachers said, every hour of our NTIP sessions led to the sharing of ideas you could use immediately in your class. The Equity Network brought to light so many unconscious subtleties that many of us have simply accepted as the unquestioned norm or status quo. And so that was something that we really challenged them to think about. And Jody Ashton, who I work with, said that the professional learning network was so different than many other professional development sessions we had offered, as it was about the teacher becoming more aware about themselves, their unconscious biases, the narratives they didn't realize they were perpetuating in order to shift their practice, to ensure all identities are celebrated and all students could see themselves in the curriculum. And just thinking about how I started the session today, and I identified my identity and my position, and I constantly have to remind myself of that because I cannot fall back to that. We talk about in a lot of ways that idea that when things get particularly uncomfortable, we try to retreat to the comfort. And that comfort is the dominant narrative for a lot of us. It's the status quo. And we have to constantly remind ourselves that that is not the place that students flourish. And it is something that we need to continually interrupt. And so, you know, some of the things that we thought about in that was, you know, the real voyage of Proust here, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And, you know, that goes back to Zaretta. How am I seeing things? What are my biases, filters, the fog that I'm walking in that is clouding the different decisions that I'm making in order to support students? When it really should be the opposite. What is the student and the student's identity, the student's religion, the student's gender, the student's ability that I should be putting at the center of that learning? And how is it that as an educator, I can use the framework of deep learning and leveraging those different frameworks in order to facilitate the success for the student, whatever that might be. And so these come from the learning that we did on Friday, you know, relearning and unlearning. This was a system-wide, and, you know, 3,000 of our staff went through this on Friday. And just really thinking about that. And I've received so many emails from educators in the last week, just really, and their reflections, and they're reaching out to me and saying, you know, wow, I didn't know. And, you know, I have more learning to do. And we had a lot of, we have books that teachers can sign out, you know, White Fragility. So you want to talk about race, a number of different books, The Third Path, so many things that the educators can be learning in. And they're signing these out voluntarily. We send out sets and to groups of educators who want to learn more. And so, you know, this is what I left them with at the end of the session last Friday. You know, it's incumbent upon us to continue learning. And as I said earlier, we need to hone our craft. There are many opportunities that it's going to happen in the school board and schools this year that we need to continue learning about this. And as I often say to the colleagues that I'm working at, we never arrive and say, we've reached equity, because, you know, there is always a place that we can do more and learn more. And Ibrahim Kendi says the heartbeat of racism is denial, and the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. And without question and without hesitation, we must identify what we need to change in ourselves, our classrooms, and our schools. And so some of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm moving forward is that liberatory design cycle. So, you know, and I go back to the conversation that I had with Richard on the phone when we first connected about speaking and, you know, mentioning how is it that we can decolonize the structures that were created to design a particular society that everybody wanted? And how can we do that within the system? and without it being a system. And so, as somebody mentioned in the previous session, it is going to get messy, and it's going to be different, but it is, I think, something, and you know, I think we can do it, as mentioned in the last session, and thinking about that. So this comes from the the National Equity Project. I was fortunate 2 years ago, when we could still travel, to go to their center in San Francisco and learn about the liberatory design cycle. And it goes back to that, my early experimentation with design thinking, and that piece around that. So when we look at the first bubble there, it says see system and empathize. It's where we recognize patterns of inequity and look at the system creating those and identify the challenge that we need to address. This could be at the school level, the classroom level, the school board level. Listening to the stories from those impacted by the challenge and build a relationship in the process. That's our empathy. You know, determine how complex the challenge is. You know, how many levels or layers does it involve in order for us to disrupt and dismantle the barriers? Looking at probing and learning more about the system and the challenge, prototyping. How is it that we can move forward with this? And then test strategies with stakeholders. And I was listening to Joe Truss, or I attended one of Joe Truss's sessions on anti-racist education over the summer, I believe it was. And if you don't know Joe, he does culturally responsive leadership out of Oakland. And he is continually challenging the colonization of our school systems as they exist in his jurisdiction and in the United States. But, you know, he used the example of how he uses it as a principle in his school. And I kind of pushed back on Joe. I don't know how well he thinks of me anymore, but I said, we really should be doing this with the students. If we're really thinking about shifting the system, the students should be at the table when we're doing the design thinking, because it is their learning. Who owns the learning? Who owns the outcome of this? It's going to be the students who are going to go forward and move forward. So that's something that I'm sort of thinking about, you know, doing more work in and communicating with my colleagues about at the system level and in the classroom level, and being connected at the Faculty of Ed here in Ottawa, just thinking about that and how we can, you know, start with the teacher ed program, moving into the new teacher program that I work with, and then, you know, shifting it towards the leaders that are in the school board. So I'm coming back to that question that we started with. How can we shift practice and structures to ensure equitable and inclusive education in decolonized schools and systems? And I noticed somebody right at the off the hop said, you know, we need to decolonize the schools and the systems first, and maybe we do need to, you know, restructure some things. I attended a session out of I think it was at Simon Fraser University, digitally, and it was on radical inclusion, and it really talked about shifting the structures, because inclusion isn't, it's just bringing people in. It's not shifting the structure that needs to happen in order to have everybody have a fulfilled experience in the learning systems that we are in. So, you know, what do I think and what do we think? I'm just gonna leave it there. I know I'm probably getting close to the end of my time, but I would love to hear some feedback. I haven't had an opportunity to be able to read a lot of the comments, but maybe if Stephen might be able to pull out some of the comments that, you know, sort of hit home, that would be great.
Just a couple minutes. Derry had a comment.
Yeah, I've got a question. I loved your "what would happen if" that you threw at us right at the beginning of your session. I also love Tom's suggestion that anything we come up with should be scalable. I really agree with that. So let me try "what happen if" on you and tell me what you think. What would happen if we suspended the school timetable for a day in every school, one day every week so that 20% of the students on any particular day could engage in self-directed learning in mixed age, all ability groups for 20% of the time. And you could create a 20% team of teachers who would really enjoy working with this way. So every kid, every week would have one day off curriculum. Now, it seems to me, you know, the state ought to be able to tolerate that. They'd still have 80% of the curriculum. So what about that as an idea? 20% time self-directed learning for all kids with a dedicated team who would take it in turns to have different groups of kids into their 20% facility, whatever it was, maybe a part of the school building. What would your response to that be? Would it be scalable? Would it be feasible?
You know, thank you for your question, Derry. Yeah, I think it is very feasible. It's something that I wanted to introduce a number of years ago to a whole school, but I do think it is scalable. We have educators that are already doing that in classrooms, but again, it's pockets, you know. Teachers who do genius hours, teachers who do project-based learning, teachers who do passion projects. So it is happening. Could it be scalable? I believe so. And I think, you know, if we are really thinking about if deep learning is implemented, you know, to its fullest, the students should be pushing that learning and guiding that learning all the time. But, you know, thinking about, you know, I'd love to get rid of, you know, all the standardized testing, all those kinds of things that really constrain the different things that we have, you know, we think we have to accomplish. And so,
sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's a proposal that is possible because it is actually happening in one or two schools in my country. I'm from the UK. It would perhaps transform the attitudes of our teachers who would otherwise find it difficult to move in this direction if they saw it actually happening within their own school. In my experience, more teachers get drawn into this approach when you start to introduce it than run away from it because it's all too scary and difficult. And it gradually introduces the notion of consulting the kids, of working with the kids in how you transform the school. You could create a 20% committee that would be staff and students. So moving away from student council that talk about the quality of the toilet paper, you could actually move towards the kids being seriously involved in change within their schools.
No, I do. I like that idea, Derry. I'm going to propose that to Tom on Monday.
Good for you.
Okay, I'm gonna have to bring this to a close. Alison, thank you so much. Derry, I don't want to ever lose sight of the quality of the toilet paper in the bathrooms. It's an important thing. But Alison, thank you, and Tom, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for a wonderful day of conversation. I want to thank you for allowing me to be among you. I come to these conversations as kind of a newbie, and it was an amazing experience to hear your thoughts and your wisdom. I wanted to maybe just leave you with one of my favorite quotes from T.S. Eliot, pulled probably out of a little bit of context, but nevertheless resonating. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So whether you come to these conversations very familiar with them, hopefully you have left knowing the place for the first time. And for people like me, I definitely know this place for the first time.
I just wanted to clarify with Derry, if in a scalability idea, are you also thinking of something called standardization? I just wanted to make it abundantly clear to myself.
It's a framework proposal that every school would develop in its own way. So I really don't like the idea of standardization.
Because scalability many times goes synonymous with standardization. for the sake of productivity. I was a little cautious about that combination. Thank you.
Not what I'm suggesting.